Good morning. I'm Rosalie Schaefer, and on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Manatee County, I welcome you to our program today. First, I'd like to recognize a public official in our audience, Carol Whitmore, County Commissioner, Commissioner at Large. 11 amendments to the Florida Constitution will be on the ballot this fall. If approved by the voters by a 60% margin, these amendments will become part of the basic governing document of our state. These amendments will have profound and long-lasting effects. To help the voters understand the amendments, we are holding a series of programs on the amendments and also presenting programs for organizations. This particular program is a set of 2 programs because we wanted to have enough time for discussion, and given the number of amendments, we would only have had time to show the slides. So part 1 of this series will cover amendments 1 through 6. And October the 8th, we will have 8 through 11, 8 through 12, 8 through 12. There was one that was not on the ballot because it was taken off and then it was put back on and given a different number. And we have some invited speakers today to speak towards some of the amendments. We have Mr. Jim Seifert. He's the county manager of the financial office there. And we also have Sheila Hopkins of the Florida Catholic Conference, and Omari Anderson, who's going to be representing the Vote No on 6 campaign. And they will speak after I show the slides. Okay, the Constitution of the State of Florida is the basic document that establishes and describes the roles, functions, and structure of the government. Florida's had a series of constitutions going all the way back to 1838 with the Territorial Constitution. The current Constitution was ratified in 1968. However, there have been quite a few changes because of the amendment process. So your considerations when you review these amendments is not only is this a good idea, also consider whether or not this particular item belongs in the Constitution or if it's better off in the state statutes where it might be easier to change if the voters change their mind afterwards. There are a number of ways an amendment can get on the Constitution. One is by the legislative process. They can place an amendment before the voters with a joint resolution. And that resolution does not have to be approved by the governor, but it does have to be approved if it has a ballot summary by the Florida Supreme Court. So if the Supreme Court says this summary is misleading and rejects it, they now can either rewrite it or they can put the entire amendment full text on the ballot. So if you see something really long on the ballot this time, that's what's happened. Citizens can put amendments on, but it's a much more difficult process. They go through the petition, the referendum process, and they have to get a huge number of signatures. Now, they used to have 4 years to get this done, but the legislature shortened that time to 2 years. So that may be one reason why no citizen initiatives are on the ballot this year. Okay, the first one is health care services. This amendment would would preclude the individual mandate in the state of Florida. Now, the Supreme Court has already ruled, it ruled after this was passed, that the individual mandate is constitutional. So this amendment, if passed, won't affect that. It'll just be more or less of a referendum. However, if in the future the Affordable Care Act is thrown out and each state is doing its own thing, then Florida would not be able to have an individual mandate unless they amend this provision. Okay, and this is the effect of voting yes on Amendment 1. Everybody ready? And voting no. Now we're going to get into the financial amendments, the tax exemption amendments, and there are so many that they also need to be looked at in the context of their cumulative impact, not just their individual impact, which our state league did in cooperation with the Collins Center for Public Policy when they developed this slide program. And they did research on the impacts to government, local government, for these reductions in the property tax and increasing the exemptions. Okay, the first one is veterans' property tax. Now, what this amendment does is simply relax one of the standards that are already in the law for this amendment. The existing property tax discount offered to disabled veterans have to meet 4 requirements. They have to be a current Florida resident, 65 or older, disabled in combat, and a Florida resident when they entered the military. And the 4th one is the one that will be eliminated. So if someone moves to Florida, they meet the other criteria, they will get this exemption. And what this discount does is makes it commensurate with their disability. So if they're designated as being a 50% disabled veteran, then their discount off of the assessed value of their property is 50%. If it's 70, 80, 90. Okay, and there is no means test for this one or most of the others. There's just one that does, but all these other property tax items do not. If you're wealthy, doesn't matter, you'll still get it. Effects of voting yes. Let me know if I'm going too fast or too slow. Too fast? Okay. Okay. Yeah, did you get one of the flyers? Yeah, okay, good. And no. And these no wins are basically all the same in that they just say what the amendment would do isn't going to happen. We retain the status quo. Okay, now this one is a big one. This one is one that a lot of people have expressed concerns about because it changes the way the state figures its limits on revenue growth. The current tax limit is based on personal income growth. And this new limit would be based on population growth and consumer inflation. The limit would apply to all state taxes, fees, and licenses. It would place any money collected over the limit into a rainy day fund and then return anything left over to the taxpayers. And it can, if the legislature wants, it can change the limit in a given year, but it would take a supermajority of the legislature to do that. Proponents say it will limit government spending and cause government to prioritize more. Opponents say it would not just limit spending, but result in deeper cuts to schools, health services, and communities. They point to the failure of this proposal in Colorado as a good example of why not to approve it. Now we include this because it is the only state that has tried this. It was called Tabor then, the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. I'm not sure what the A is for. But anyway, it was approved by the voters in 1992 in Colorado, but they later suspended it because the formula ended up cutting deeply into school funding, health care for children, senior services, and infrastructure programs. Business groups blamed Tabor for slowing the state's economic development and ability to recover from the last recession. If you want more information about that, and when you get on your home computer, you can just Google in Colorado and Tabor, and you'll see a lot of in-depth studies that were done on this proposal. Okay, Amendment 4 is a variety of property tax reductions. And some of them would expand the homestead exemption into non-homesteaded properties. Perceived inequities in the current system led business interests to propose tax breaks for non-homesteaded properties and first-time buyers. This proposal would extend property tax breaks to things like vacation homes, rental, and commercial property. A homestead exemption would also be available to home buyers in less than 1 year instead of after 1 year. Proponents say it will help the real estate market and jobs. Critics say the proposal will hurt cash-strapped school districts and local government. They ask if money is reduced, then who will replace those funds in the local government coffers? And here's the impact of voting yes. They're all very complicated, and we have more on our website. There's one thing you can click on that gives you a much more detailed description of what these will do. And our website is lwvmanatee.org. Okay, state courts. This is a very important amendment that has implications for the independence of the judicial branch and the balance of power in the state. Since 1972, Florida has used the merit selection and retention process for state Supreme Court justices. Currently, the governor fills the openings by appointing a nominee from the list presented by the Judicial Nominating Commission. If passed, this amendment would allow the Florida Senate to reject or approve these nominees. It would also give members of the State House of Representatives expanded access to confidential files involving judges accused of misconduct, and would give the lawmakers the right to repeal procedural court rules with just a simple majority instead of a 2/3 majority vote as currently required. Supporters of Amendment 5 say it will bring a much-needed change to a court system that gives the governor too much power. Opponents say the measure is an attempt to exert political influence over the judicial branch. Okay, this is the last one for today. This Amendment 6 would prohibit funding for abortion and elimination of privacy rights as a reason to reject proposed legislation. Because state and federal law already prohibit public funds from being spent on abortion, this would not change the current abortion funding practices, but it would enshrine them in our Constitution, making them more difficult to change. Rather, this amendment would affect a provision in the state constitution that has been cited in the courts as a reason to strike down some proposed anti-abortion laws. And this is what the provision says. Every natural person has the right to be let alone and free from governmental intrusion into the person's private life. That was approved by the voters in 1980. So you can see that's a much stronger provision than what is in the U.S. Constitution. U.S. Constitution's privacy right is largely being construed from several amendments in the Constitution, and it's not as direct a statement. If passed, Amendment 6 would remove the state's constitution's specific right to privacy as it relates to abortion rights. Supporters say this amendment puts the state on an even footing with the federal government's requirements. Opponents say it's a preemptive strike on a woman's right to choose. Yeah, as you can see, it's not just for the abortion, but also health insurance coverage of abortion if public funds are involved. Okay. Now we're going to go in order with our amendments with our invited speakers, and we don't have a speaker to address one, but we do have one to address all the financial ones, starting with Amendment 2. So, Mr. Seifert, we'd appreciate your coming up and telling us what you think. Our time is looking pretty good, so since you're addressing so many, 10 minutes is in order.
Okay, well, I'll start with some general comments. What happens with most of these amendments that are related to providing tax breaks is that regardless of whether the tax breaks are large or small, the people who get the tax breaks get the breaks, but it means that someone else ends up paying the taxes that the people getting the breaks don't pay. So there's always a shift. Now, as that relates to Amendment 2, it's not much of a shift because we're not talking about a large sum of money. And I don't have much to say about Amendment 2. I don't think, although I have some estimates of what some of these amendments would mean to Manatee County government, I don't think that Amendment 2 would have much of a financial impact. But again, if some people get a break and pay less in taxes, it always means that someone else is going to pick up the slack and pay more. Now, Amendment 3 is the amendment that limits state revenue. And this does not directly affect local government, but again, there's always secondary consequences. If the state has a revenue limit and they decide they can't afford to do things, they have traditionally passed the costs on to local governments. And when they pass the costs on to local governments, it means your property taxes have to be higher. Now, as it relates to these revenue caps, as was mentioned in the summary provided before, most states who have had these on the ballot have rejected the revenue caps. Colorado did vote for one, but they did suspend it because it did have unintended consequences and adverse effects, not just on their governments, but on their economy as a whole. And one of the negatives with the revenue caps is that they tend to be arbitrary. They don't take into account all of the things that can possibly happen. And of course, when you elect your legislature, you expect them to make tough decisions and respond to the crisis of the day, and sometimes that requires creativity, and sometimes it even requires more money. It's impossible to predict what types of things may happen in the future that your legislature may have to deal with. Now, Florida's cap is written, the proposal on the ballot is written to try to minimize some of the negatives. So what they've done is they've put in some exceptions to the cap. One of those exceptions is that it doesn't apply to revenue that's required to pay for the state's share of Medicaid. It also doesn't include school property taxes and school fees and tuition. Now that makes it a little easier to live with, but at the same time, these are some pretty big exceptions. These are some very large portions of the state budget. So you have to ask the question then, how effective is this cap really going to be? Is it going to achieve its objective? And that's an important question. And then there's an additional consideration because there's two different ways that the legislature can vote to override the cap. One is with a 3/5 majority and one is with a 2/3 majority, and they both work in slightly different ways. But then what you have is, and let's just take, if you consider a regular budget year, say 2012, the legislature approved the budget by more than a 2/3 majority. So it's very common when the legislature decides how much they want to spend and how much they want to collect in revenue and taxes, it's very common that they're going to have more than a 2/3 majority of the members going along with the approval. So basically, nullification of this by the legislature could become a very routine event. And you may end up with something in the Constitution that really isn't heeded very often and can be nullified by routine action of the legislature. So some folks are asking, you know, is this type of provision really something that rises to the stature and dignity that you would want for language in your Constitution? And I'm not advocating one way or another. I'm just trying to point out some of the issues. Of course, the people who support this believe that it's good fiscal policy to have limits on what the government can do, and you know, that's their ideological philosophy, and you know, it looks good for some folks on their resume when they're running for election that they support these types of things. But they are arbitrary, and they have had problems in the past. So those are a few comments on Amendment 3. Amendment 4 is a much bigger issue. As I said, Amendment 3 wouldn't necessarily have any direct impact on our local government, other than that very possibly we would see the state shift more and more of their financial responsibilities to local government. Amendment 4 is different because it's aimed entirely at local government. Now, it doesn't really affect schools very much. For the most part, they're not included. And basically what it does is it would set limitations on property values for those who pay property taxes. And this is very complicated because it deals with 4 or 5 different issues. Now, if you had a citizen's petition, you could only deal with one issue. But under certain circumstances, the legislature can put items on the ballot that address more than one issue. And like I said, this one in particular deals with 4 or 5 different issues. Now, back in 2011, when the legislature was discussing this, many of the proponents of this Amendment 4 were speaking from the perspective that it was their belief that Save Our Homes — does everyone know what Save Our Homes is? It's a cap on your property value, so it can't go up by more than 3% per year. And over the years since 1992, when that went into effect, a lot of people are paying property taxes, especially long-time homeowners, that are limited to a great extent because while market values have gone up, their taxable value can only go up by 3% per year. And you know, what we've seen is the tax burden has shifted away from homestead property owners, and it's more on investment property owners, commercial property owners, business property owners, people owning second homes, and so on. And so the talk was that the current Save Our Homes structure is not a business-friendly way to limit property taxes. And I'm not making this up. You can find quotes in the newspaper that will back this up. It's not speculation. And so the idea was, first they knew that if they put on the ballot a repeal of Save Our Homes, it would never pass. So what they did instead is they came up with this, which provides a lot of similar benefits to non-homestead property owners, so that the Save Our Homes protections don't help you as much as they might have once helped you. And there are certain property owners who stand to benefit perhaps more than others, and some people have called this a tax break for snowbirds because, particularly, for instance, out-of-state residents who own a second home here, or out-of-state residents who buy a home here for the first time and decide to establish their homestead here, will realize some fairly significant benefits. And the biggest benefits go to the first-time home buyer, regardless of whether they're from out-of-state or in-state. If you're a first-time home buyer, you get some special breaks on the value of your property. It's conceivable that a first-time home buyer could pay almost zero in property taxes to their local governments. That's 10 minutes? Okay. Okay, sure. Just to be fair, though, I did want to say that there is one thing in here that does help the homestead property owner, and that is that if your value goes down, your market value, you would no longer be subject to the 3% increase in your taxable value. And this may have helped you in recent years as property values were dropping, but as property values are going up, it won't be as helpful to you. Thank you.
Okay, now for Amendment 5, there are no speakers, so we're going to go right to Amendment 6. And I'd like to ask each speaker to speak for 5 minutes, and we'll start with Pro. And then we'll have 1-minute rebuttals after the 5 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions on any of the amendments of any of our speakers. So if we could start with the pro. Those in favor of-
Good afternoon. Thank you, Rosalie, for allowing me to present the pro side of 6 on behalf of Citizens for Protecting Taxpayers and Parental Rights. This amendment to the state constitution would continue the current prohibition on the use of public funds for abortion, except they may be utilized in 3 instances: rape, incest, and life-threatening conditions to the mother. This mirrors the current federal government restrictions, usually called the Hyde Amendment, which has been in effect since 1978. In 1980, in Harris versus McRae, the U.S. Supreme Court determined that funding restrictions created by Hyde did not violate the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Furthermore, the court opined that while the government may not block a woman's exercise of choice, it is not required to remove obstacles not created by the government, such as an inability to pay for an abortion. The amendment would prohibit public funding of health coverage through state exchanges using state and federal funds, a prohibition already in Florida statutes, except for the exceptions I mentioned previously. If passed, any future changes in expenditures of public funds required in federal law would also apply to Florida. This amendment does not change a woman's right to abortion guaranteed by the Roe v. Wade decision almost 40 years ago. The important point I want to share about Amendment 6 is the need to right a wrong. In '89, the Florida Supreme Court in In Re TW ruled that Article 1, Section 23, the Right of Privacy Clause, gives broader rights to an abortion than those contained in the U.S. Constitution. Because of this interpretation, the court invalidated a parental consent statute, even though the U.S. Supreme Court had previously upheld parental consent statutes. In Florida, parental notice was also struck down until it was restored in 2004, when 62% of the voters approved a new Article 10, Section 22. Now, to be clear, because there's some confusion, notice just means a doctor performing the abortion or a referring physician must make an attempt to contact the parents and let them know that their minor child is going to have an abortion, but it is not required to have their permission. So your minor child under 18 can have an abortion without your permission, even though parents are required to give permission for ear piercing, body piercing, medications in school. There certainly is, and also the thing that you also have to understand, if there's complications, and I can give you examples of that, if there's complications, you as a parent would be responsible for the medical bills from that abortion. While this amendment does not automatically bring back parental consent, its passage would allow legislation to be proposed that would give back parents the right to make the medical decisions that affect their minor child. And I think most people who are parents or guardians believe you have the right to be active and responsible in decisions that would affect the well-being of your child. So we encourage saying yes because it would prevent public funds. It could be used for other needs like medical needies, senior citizens, children, for them to be used for these people with special needs versus for abortions, except in the cases of rape, incest, and health of the mother. That was my 5 minutes? Okay. Place the same limits on use of public funds in Florida as is now required in federal law. So if the federal law changes, then that would be the same thing that would apply in Florida. And open the door to restore parental rights, because I can again give you examples. Dr. Randy Armstrong, who is the chairman of this committee, was an OBGYN doctor at a Tampa hospital. A 14-year-old came in profusely bleeding. They had to operate her on twice to save her life, and she will never be able to have children again. Again, her parents knew nothing about it until the hospital called and said, your child is here and you're responsible for these medical bills. So there are many cases of that have happened, and we're just saying parents should have that right to be involved in their child's medical decisions. Thank you.
Hello, how's everyone doing today? My name's Omari Anderson. and I'm here on the vote from the Vote No on 6 committee. Can you hear me? I apologize. Is that better? Okay, let me repeat that. My name's Omari Anderson, and I'm here on behalf of the Vote No on 6 committee for Amendment 6. And I'm urging you to vote no on Amendment 6 simply because, as the speaker before me stated, it's not going to change anything. You know, the Hyde Amendment, and there's a Florida statute that prohibits using state funds for abortions. But what it will change is it's going to take away the health insurance rights of our first responders, people we depend on most in the state, our teachers, our firefighters, our policemen. If they're covered under the state insurance, they will no longer have the opportunity to make their own medical decisions with respect to an abortion. I agree that, you know, parents should know what's going on with their children and their children's medical choices. I totally agree. I'm standing with my opposition for that. But this bill does not change that. Currently, in the state constitution, it requires parental notification. This bill would require parental consent for an abortion. And in some instances where you have a child who's, let's say, molested by a step-parent or an uncle or something like that, this would prevent that child from having a proper hearing done. So the notice requirement that currently stands in Florida is a child can go before a judge, and the judge can determine whether or not to waive their notice requirement. So I don't want anybody to confuse the issue and think that we're advocating for children to do whatever they want willy-nilly. It's not about the children. That's a small percentage. The bigger issue here is taking away the people we depend on most, such as our teachers, firefighters, municipal workers, police officers, their right to make their own medical decisions. Politicians should not make that choice. Even if you do not believe this, we need to decide whether or not this should be in the Florida Constitution. Even if you believe, like my opponent believes, maybe we should have this in the statute, but it should not be in the Florida Constitution. So I'm urging you on November 6th to vote no on Amendment 6. Thank you.
When you ask your question, please come to the microphone and state your name. And you can direct your question at one of our guests or all of them, depending on what your subject is. And they can rebut each other.
My name's Carol Whitmore, and I'm a member of the club. And I have a question on Amendment 6. I'm pro-choice, but I'm different because I don't believe in public funding for it. But here's my deal. Let's say that they have the procedure done and they're a minor or whatever. I'm a nurse, and that's why I'm asking this. Does anybody know, and if anybody could find out, a lot of times that's done in an outpatient facility, not associated with the hospital. Let's say they do start bleeding, they have to go into the hospital. That's a complication, a hemorrhage after a procedure. I just want to know, would health insurance pay for that? Because I really truly think they would. My husband's a surgeon, and he does cosmetic surgery, and you know, at times you have to bring the patient to the hospital, and insurance pays for that. So I don't know if you guys know that or if that's written in the law. That would be very interesting for the public to know that, if anybody would know that or could get us all the information.
Yes, if that child was transported to to a medical facility, then I would been pretty sure their health insurance would pay for it. The shock would be that the parents might not know that their child ended up there. So yes, they would be paid for. There's something else you said that I was going to address, but let me remember what you had said.
I'm not well versed in the specifics of what would happen after the medical procedure and once a child is hemorrhaging. I believe that if the child is covered under some other insurance policy, they would be covered for, you know, transportation to the hospital and the procedure at the hospital. But I'm not for sure, so don't quote me on that. Thank you.
I have a question. Is this on or not? Okay. My question is, I'm not real clear. What do you mean by this affects first responders, the police, the teachers, people who apparently have insurance through the government. Are you referring to their children or to these adults?
Can you hear me? The proposed amendment would deny state funds from being used toward these medical procedures. And we have, it's the firefighters and these other individuals that you listed who receive their health insurance benefits partially through the state. They pay into it and their state pays into it as well. So they would no longer be able to receive these medical procedures, whether it's the wife of the firefighter, if it's the firefighter's child. So this is how it affects everyone.
Can I just make one comment about that? I have contacted people who work for the state of Florida government. This is the first time that I've heard any. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know your comment about the first responders that would affect their insurance. But we are checking into that because I would like to know that. That was not our impression. It was federal or state funds. Many places like fire departments are funded by county funds. So we are looking to get a clarification for that. Thank you.
I'm so sorry. My apologies. I don't mean to go tit for tat, but I wanted to be clear that, you know, these municipal funds that are used for our fire department and our other first responders in our municipalities come from the state. So, you know, the state raises taxes, so that's where these funds come from. So it's all one, whether it's somebody who works for the state of Florida or they work for the city of Sarasota. They still would be affected by Amendment 6 passing. Thank you.
Amendment 10, and I don't think we got to Amendment 10, did we? Yeah. Oh, all right, never mind.
Does it have to do with finance?
Yeah, it does, and it's just kind of vague what the machinery and equipment and business property.
Tangible property.
But yeah, what taxes they're getting exempted from.
Yeah, we'll cover that more next session, but if you want to say a word about it.
I will comment briefly. Tangible personal property, the typical taxpayer does not know much about that because it doesn't affect you unless you own a business. But this is equipment and machinery. If you go to a grocery store, the shelving or the freezer units would be taxed at the same rate that real property is taxed. A company like Tropicana or Florida Power and Light, the majority of the value of their property is intangible personal property. So the average taxpayer probably doesn't know much about that, but it does constitute maybe 7 to 10% of the tax roll in a typical county or city. So it is a significant portion of the tax money that people in government are relying upon. But more information can be provided at the next one.
I have a question again on Prop 6. It says that public funds cannot be used for an abortion, but we're into this public worker thing. It seems to me that they're not saying you can't have the abortion, they're just saying public funds can't be used for it. And if the public funds are used to pay for the insurance of an EMT person, for example, then it's the insurance that's paying for it, not the public funds. Is that correct, or what am I misunderstanding here?
So if I understand your question correctly, you're trying to make a distinction between the public funds and the insurance?
And the fact that the public funds are allegedly financing the abortion.
Okay. Okay. Now, if somebody, God forbid, needed a heart transplant, and go with me here, but if somebody needed a heart transplant, and then you had this health insurance, and your health insurance provider then told you, after you've been paying for so many years, that you're not covered for this, I think it's the same type of argument where you would feel as if you were duped. Because you paid into an insurance policy thinking that X, Y, and Z would be covered, and when you need it, it's no longer available because the Florida legislature has decided that they no longer want to cover this. I think these decisions are not ones for the Florida legislature, but are decisions that we should have, women make in consultation with their doctors, their families, and their faith. So at the end of the day, I think we should keep the Florida legislature out of making these types of decisions and blindly deciding what procedures can and cannot be paid for.
You're using our tax dollars, and I feel it's not right to make me pay for somebody's abortion. I don't pay for vasectomies. I don't pay for heart transplants. I don't pay for appendectomies.
Okay, ma'am,
Okay,
ma'am,
show me how.
but you do.
Well, that's a prescription. Yes, and you get it. And a person. Okay, but I'm not paying for it. How?
Of the first responders, you would pay for their insurance costs to cover their prescription, so you would pay for that as well. But
I completely object to my dollars paying for abortions. I think it's morally wrong to ask me to do that. That's all. And I want to know why the parental consent is not mentioned in this paper also, because I think that's a very important component of this amendment, that parental consent should be mentioned, and it's not mentioned. If I were to take this to my friends and they don't see that parental consent is mentioned, then they don't know that that's, it's part of it, and that's huge. Thank you.
all right. Well, I actually agree with you, and I wouldn't want my tax dollars going to fund somebody else's abortion as well. But I would like to raise the point that the young lady to the left has made, that we pay for a lot of other procedures, and we do pay for heart transplants, and we do pay for men to use Viagra because it's covered under their insurance. Now, I want to also make it clear that as far as the consent goes, the Florida Constitution currently requires parental notification, which can be waived through judicial bypass. So we're not asking parents not to be informed, but in certain situations, consent would be too much. And one last point I wanted to address that you made was that in 2011, there were only 3 instances of people who were covered under Medicaid who opted to have this procedure. So, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, and that's 3 instances in the state of Florida. So on the grand scheme of things, your tax dollars are not going toward these procedures. And voting for this law is not going to change that. So we want you to vote no on Amendment 6 because it's not going to make a big difference. But I'm only here to present the facts, so you're welcome to your own opinion, but thank you.
I did want to just make a comment on the oft repeated phrase that this is coming between a woman and her doctor. Well, quite honestly, when you go to an abortion clinic, this is not your regular doctor, and you're not going to see that doctor until you're on the table and prepped and ready to have that abortion. So if you're going to an abortion clinic, this is not your regular doctor that you are seeing. I also wanted to say that this does not prevent anybody from having an abortion. They can pay for that abortion. And I also want to say that in 2006, when we had the women's health and safety legislation that I advocated for, is to have stronger regulations on clinics so that women who made that decision didn't go and get chopped up and and injured by having the proper medical personnel there, having the proper equipment and all that kind of stuff, because there are women, and it happens regularly, that women go to clinics and then they're transported to the hospital because in an ambulance because they have had complications. So, and I'll give you a bad example of that. In Miami, there was a situation where a woman, the person that was attending as the anesthesiologist was the janitor, And this woman had her baby, and they put the baby in a bag and threw the bag up on top of the clinic. So these are things that any normal person would want to avoid happening to somebody.
You're right. You know, the proponent for Amendment 6 is absolutely right. Nobody would want these procedures to happen. But when you have a teacher who's only making $25,000 a year, and she's pregnant, and it's a wanted pregnancy. You know, she has a family, and her and her husband have been trying for years, and she's finally pregnant and she's going to term, and then she finds out that her fetus is growing without a brain. You know, I think her insurance should continue to provide her the option to opt out of having to care for, you know, a severely disabled child, because she might not be able to afford that. That might further bankrupt her, and I think women deserve the right to have their own choices in family planning. At the end of the day, what this does is takes away their right to make their own decisions in family planning and their right to choose.
Okay, but again, I need to clarify. If I'm working and I draw a salary, how can the state tell me how to spend my salary? It's as simple as that.
I absolutely agree. I don't think it's the state's duty to tell us how to spend our money or to spend an individual's money or...
Benefits are part of that. If I'm working and I get benefits and I use that for whatever I need, be it an abortion or be it tonsillectomy. Okay? So I'm sure, I just don't understand your position.
Not his.
No, I'm talking about whatever.
Do I understand it correctly that this provision, number 6, does not say anything about requiring consent of the parents? It's only the notification we're talking about. So whether you want consent of the parents or not, this doesn't have anything to do with that. Is that correct?
That is correct.
If passed, it would allow the legislature to pass legislation to bring back parental consent, because right now we cannot have parental consent because the Florida Supreme Court struck it down. And quite honestly, in the right to privacy clause that they mentioned was put in the Constitution for informational rights, but the Florida Supreme Court used it to strike down some of the abortion legislation, previous abortion legislation. Maybe we should just stand here.
I really don't think we should use Amendment 6 in 2012 to fight battles that were fought in 1989 or Roe v. Wade. I mean, you know what, let's stop with these same arguments. The legislature is trying to, you know, waste our time and our tax dollars by bringing these same old arguments every couple of years. So yes, you know, we currently have a parental notification piece, and it's working fine. Let's keep that. Let's not ask for anything else, and let's vote no on Amendment 6. Thank you.
I have a question on Amendment 4, and it has to do with first-time homeowners. And I just wondered if you could clarify how things may have changed in the last 20 years. For example, I get the benefit of the current law. What if one of my relatives wanted to move here and they would be a first-time resident? Who would this apply to?
First of all, the definition of a first-time homeowner is anyone who has not owned a home in Florida in the last 3 years. So it's not really first-time homeowner. It could be someone who had a home and maybe lost it through foreclosure or moved out of state and came back. So it's a pretty generous definition. Now, secondly, let's say that this is in your neighborhood and you have a home that you bought in 1990, okay, and you've had the full benefit of Save Our Homes. And let's say that the home may have been worth much more, but now it's worth $150,000. But because of Save Our Homes, your value is around $75,000 or so. So let's say someone comes in next door and and buys a house almost just like yours for $150,000, they would get a tax. First of all, they would get the standard $50,000 homestead exemption, plus they would get an exemption equal to 50% of the average homestead value in the county. So in this case, they could get an exemption that's maybe another $50,000 or more, 75. They could possibly live next to you and pay no property taxes whatsoever for the first year. But then the next year, you pay 20%, then 40%, then 60%. After 5 years, all the property taxes are equalized. But for that first year and that first 2 years or even 3 years, when they're getting a big break, well, then someone else is paying for all the services that these no folks are getting, and they're not paying for it. So basically, you're subsidizing. Now, Tax Watch Florida did a study, and they said that this could provide some large economic benefits to certain sectors of the economy. Some people will benefit, and maybe more homes will be built. Realtors might sell more homes, and so on. So they said that, you know, there will be tangible economic benefits, but at the same time, the people who are existing taxpayers will have to pay to make up for what the new property owners and the others whose values are limited by the caps, whatever they save, someone else has to pay.
Thank you. Thank everybody. We'd like to thank all our speakers for coming today and for helping to add so much to this discussion. I think we all have a better idea now of what these amendments say and what the different viewpoints on them are. And don't miss part 2, October 8th, the second Monday in October, and we'll be discussing some other pretty important amendments. And this program will be shown on Manatee TV and also on their YouTube link, so you can go on their website, www.metv.web.com, and watch it again if you want. Thank you so much for coming, and please take some of the flyers in the back and consider joining the League of Women Voters and get active in helping the voters. Thank you again for coming.